It's commonly said in psychoanalytic literature that schizoid individuals tend to be conflict avoidant, and this is usually linked to safety sensitivity. However, I think that there's a bit more to it than that. In some cases, especially if an individual has grown up in a hostile environment and has suffered some degree of trauma as a consequence of that, it's understandable why they may be averse to conflict. However, with schizoid individuals, we don't all develop along the same path, and so some of us don't have any particular violence or serious disturbances in our past growing up in our home environment, and also no memory of any particular trauma. I think that due to this, there can be other factors that contribute towards conflict avoidance other than the feeling of fear or potentially the revival of negative memories from the past. I've talked about primary schizoids developing along a path where they're born with an inherent sensitivity to stimuli, and as a consequence of that, have withdrawn into themselves in order to develop a buffer zone between themselves and the environment so as not to be overstimulated. I think that with primary schizoid development, there tends to be a very logical stance, and the reason for that is because emotions are muted as part of the process of creating a buffer between the self and the environment. A lot of thought goes into logical territory and intellectual processes. That's not to say that the primary schizoid can't also be very logical. However, with the primary schizoid, logic is going to be a necessity rather than an option, or rather than something that is developed later on as a consequence of when necessity becomes, as a consequence of when necessity comes into the equation. So with the secondary schizoids, after time, there can be a need to release or distance oneself from one's emotions and to lean upon logic. But for the primary schizoid, they're going to have to lean on the logic from the beginning, because the emotional development becomes stunted more or less like off the get-go, or within a time period where there's no consciousness of emotion, so emotional development doesn't take place. Back to the conflict. So when people think about a person that is conflict avoidant, they think of a person that is fearful, scared, or perhaps doesn't want to rock the boat because of insecurities. However, there's another side to this. When we think about it from a logical point of view, conflict with others doesn't really make any sense. If you think about conflict, what is the point in starting negative relations with another person? It doesn't make any sense unless you have something to gain from that. Now, with people who are non-schizoids, they have a lot more stronger ego urges, and this means that sometimes they want to stamp their way on the environment around them, and this can mean arguing or pushing against the environment to get what they want. some people who are non-schizoid enjoy drama. They can gain excitement or some sort of pleasure from conflict. There is a lot of different reasons why people engage in conflict. But with schizoid individuals, we don't need to impose ourselves onto the environment, and there wouldn't really be anything to gain from initiating conflict or getting involved in conflict. In most situations, the conflict is going to come or try to come from the other person, and so other people might try to draw us into conflict for whatever reasons they have. However, for us, there isn't really a logical reason for becoming involved in conflict, and because we're quite indifferent really to other people. I mean, if there's an actual physical threat, that is a different ball game. But I'm talking about just in general, like argumentative types of conflict. So when there's nothing to gain from conflict, it doesn't make logical sense to engage in it, especially when the other person stands to gain and we don't stand to gain anything. As I said, if it came down to physical protection, of course, anyone is going to stand their ground and do what they have to do. However, when it comes to just everyday sort of back and forth, arguing, trying to gain territory in the external world, schizoids aren't going to be really interested in engaging in those sorts of interactions. I wanted to make the point that avoiding conflict isn't necessarily linked to something emotional, but it is more linked to a logical stance. As I said, for some, there is another strand to this. If they have experienced physical attacks in the past. However, even in some of those situations, because of the defenses that were gained as a consequence of having to detach from negative situations, it can give us a stronger stance in situations where potential physical altercations might take place. So it's not necessarily that schizoids are going to be fearful or avoidant when it comes to conflict, but a lot of times it's going to be more a decision of, does this make sense? And if it's not logical, we're not going to be emotionally triggered into conflict in the way that certain other people are. Yeah, so I think I've made a point, and I think it needed clarifying, because the fearful image of someone avoiding conflict isn't really representative in a lot of cases. And also, going back to repercussions, it's like conflict creates repercussions. It requires energy, it requires interacting externally, and because we're more drawn to our internal world and not particularly wanting to interact externally, number one, you don't want to engage in conflict in the first place, and number two, you don't want to engage in the repercussions that come from conflict, and therefore conflict will only be entertained if there is something essential on the line that's being threatened, and in particularly if our physical being is under threat. Yeah, so I think I can wrap it up there. I hope you found this relatable, slightly rambly, but yeah. Till the next time.